Victoria Hayes stared at the restaurant bill with trembling hands. The billionaire who owned half the city suddenly whispered words no one expected to hear, words that made the air around her feel different, words that didn't belong to a woman whose name appeared on the covers of financial magazines, whose portrait hung in the lobbies of towers she had built from nothing. She said them quietly, almost to herself. But the room was not quiet enough. The table beside her heard it. The couple near the window heard it. And somewhere in the back of the dining room, a man sitting alone heard it too. A man who had no reason to care, no reason to stand up, no reason to do anything at all. "I can't afford this meal," she said. And in the brief silence that followed, someone laughed. Some thought she was joking. Others reached for their phones. A woman in pearls at the nearest table tilted her head with the kind of smile people wear when they believe they are witnessing something delightful, a performance by the very rich, a bit of theater to entertain the room. A younger man in a gray suit muttered something to his dinner companion, and both of them grinned. Nobody moved to help. Nobody looked at her the way you look at someone who is not joking at all. Nobody, that is, except one man sitting 3 tables away, a quiet single father named Ethan Carter, who noticed something in that moment that every other person in the room had completely failed to see. He noticed her hands, and because he noticed her hands, he stood up, walked across the polished floor, and made a decision that neither of them would ever forget, a decision that would alter the course of 2 lives, and before the night was over, bring an entire restaurant to a standstill that no one inside it had seen coming. Victoria Hayes had not always been the kind of woman people whispered about when she walked into a room, though it had been so long since she was anything else that the memory of ordinary life had grown soft and distant, like a photograph left too long in sunlight. She had built her first company at 26, with borrowed money and a ferocity that her early investors described, in later interviews, as almost frightening, not because she was unkind, but because she simply did not stop. She did not rest. She did not hesitate. She moved through obstacles the way water moves through rock, not by force alone, but by absolute, patient, unstoppable persistence. By the time she was 35, she owned 3 companies. By 40, she controlled a real estate portfolio that stretched across 4 cities. By 48, she had established an investment fund that bore her name, and the financial press had taken to calling her the Iron Queen, a title she neither encouraged nor objected to, because the truth was that she had long since stopped caring what they called her. What the press did not write about, because she had been careful never to let them see it, was the silence in her apartment at night, the dinners eaten alone at a marble counter with nothing but financial reports for company, the way she sometimes stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of her penthouse and looked out at the city, her city, in a manner of speaking, and felt something she could not name, but which sat in the center of her chest like a stone. She had spent decades choosing the boardroom over the dinner table, the deal over the phone call, the quarterly report over the birthday card. She had told herself, every year for 20 years, that there would be time later, that the work mattered now, and the rest could wait. She had been wrong about that. She had been catastrophically, irreversibly wrong, and she had learned it too late to do anything except carry the knowledge around with her like something broken that could no longer be fixed. She had no husband. She had no children. She had employees, and associates, and advisors, and a personal assistant named Diane who managed her calendar with military precision, but she did not have, in any meaningful sense, anyone who would notice if she did not come home. The Iron Queen. She had earned the title honestly. She had also, in earning it, given up more than she had understood at the time. That was the part nobody wrote about. That was the part that, on certain evenings, became almost impossible to carry. It was on one such evening that Victoria Hayes arrived, without a reservation. At Hargrove, the kind of restaurant that required reservations made weeks in advance, that occupied the ground floor of a converted brownstone on the east side of the city, that was lit by candlelight and decorated in warm wood and ivory linen, the sort of place where quiet conversations happened over excellent food and good bottles of wine. She arrived without her usual security detail. She arrived without Diane. She arrived, as she almost never did, entirely alone, no buffer between herself and the world, no assistant to manage the moment, no bodyguard to make the space around her feel controlled. She had left all of it behind deliberately, because tonight was not a night for armor. Tonight was a night for something else. Though she could not have told you exactly what, The maître d' recognized her immediately and found her a table without a word about the lack of reservation. She sat down, folded her hands on the linen cloth, and looked at the menu for a long moment without seeing it. Around her, the restaurant hummed with the easy sound of people who were glad to be where they were, the low music of pleasure and company, and a good evening freely chosen. She was aware of it the way you are aware of warmth through glass. Present, but not quite reachable. That same evening, Ethan Carter had come to Hargrove for a reason that had nothing to do with any of that. He had come because a potential client had suggested the place a contractor named Morrison who was thinking about bringing his fleet of vehicles to Ethan's garage for ongoing maintenance, and who believed that a business conversation went better over a proper meal than over a desk. Ethan had agreed to the dinner because he needed the account. Not magnificently, but well enough to pay his bills, well enough to keep 2 mechanics employed, well enough to provide a decent life for himself and his daughter, Sophie, who was 13 and currently staying with her grandmother for the evening. He had worn his best jacket. He had arrived on time. And then Morrison had called, 20 minutes before the reservation, to say he was sorry but something had come up at home. Could they reschedule? Ethan had said yes, of course, no problem at all. And then he had stood on the sidewalk outside Hargrove for a moment, in his best jacket, and decided that he was going to go in anyway. He had driven 40 minutes. He was hungry. He would eat. He was given a small table near the back, a table for 2 with 1 chair conspicuously empty, and he ordered the lamb because it was what the server recommended, and a glass of something red because it seemed appropriate, and he sat in the warm light of the restaurant and was quietly, privately glad to have a moment to himself. He was not a man who required company constantly, though he had learned to prefer it in the years since his wife, Laura, had died. Those first years alone had been so profoundly quiet that quiet itself had changed its meaning for him, had ceased to feel like rest, and begun to feel like the absence of something necessary. He had learned, eventually, to be all right in it, but he had never quite learned to be comfortable with it. So he sat, and he ordered, and he looked around the room with the mild, unhurried curiosity of a man who is in no particular hurry, and that was how he came to notice Victoria Hayes. He did not know who she was, not at first. He noticed her the way you notice anyone sitting alone at a restaurant, with a brief, reflexive recognition of shared circumstance, and then looked away, and looked back, because there was something about the way she was sitting that struck him as wrong in a way he could not immediately articulate. She was upright, composed, exactly the way a woman of her bearing would sit in a restaurant of this kind, but her hands, resting on the table on either side of her water glass, were not composed. Her hands were doing something private and involuntary that the rest of her posture was working very hard to conceal. And Ethan Carter, who had spent enough years learning to read the difference between the face a person shows the world and the one they actually wear underneath, understood in a single glance that this woman, whoever she was not all right. He watched her without staring, the way you watch something you are not sure you are meant to see. He saw her glance at her phone, not the casual glance of someone checking messages, but the particular glance of someone waiting for something that has not come. He saw her lift her wine glass and set it down without drinking. He saw her look at the empty chair across from her, with an expression that was not quite grief and not quite anger but contained something of both, something layered and old and specific. He had no idea what her name was. He had no idea what she had built or what she owned or what any of it meant. He knew only that she was alone in a way that went beyond the absence of other people at her table, and that something about it was familiar to him in a way that sat low and certain in his chest. The waiter brought her the bill, and Ethan watched her look at it. He watched her face change, not dramatically, not in a way most people would have caught, but in the small, precise way a face changes when something expected turns suddenly into something unbearable. Her lips pressed together. Her chin dropped very slightly. And then she said, it said the words that were already rippling outward through the restaurant by the time Ethan fully processed them. I can't afford this meal. She said it quietly, to no one, or to herself, or to the empty chair. The couple to her left heard it and exchanged a glance that became a smile. A man in a blue tie turned around in his chair, sized her up, and said, just loudly enough to be social, billionaires make the strangest jokes. There was a ripple of appreciative laughter from those nearby, friendly, amused. The kind of laughter that assumes it has understood something correctly. Nobody moved. Nobody asked. Nobody looked at her hands, which were pressed flat against the tablecloth now, trembling in a way that was no longer subtle, in a way that told Ethan everything he needed to know. He set down his fork. He pushed back his chair. He picked up his own bill, which the server had left at his elbow 10 minutes earlier. And he crossed the dining room 3 tables, a matter of perhaps 15 steps. And he stopped beside her table. And he said, quietly, without theater, "Excuse me, I'd like to take care of that, if you'll allow me." She looked up at him. He watched her try to place him, try to understand what was happening, watch the confusion move across her face before the composure reasserted itself. "That's not necessary," she said. Her voice was steady. "I appreciate it, but that's quite all right." "I know it isn't necessary," Ethan said. "I'd still like to." He set his own bill on the edge of her table and signaled the server before she could say anything else. She tried twice more to refuse him. He was patient each time, unhurried, without the slightly performative quality that generosity sometimes has when it wants to be noticed. He was simply doing what he had decided to do, and her refusals did not appear to particularly unsettle him. That, more than anything, was what gave her pause, not the offer itself, but the quality of it. The way he stood beside her table, with the calm of a man who had no agenda beyond the thing itself. She had encountered generosity before, of course. She had encountered it largely in contexts where something was wanted in return: attention, access, gratitude that could be leveraged later into something more concrete. She had become, over the years, very efficient at recognizing that particular species of kindness. This did not look like that. This looked like something else, and she was not entirely sure what to do with it. "Sit down," she said, finally. Not an invitation exactly, more the kind of statement that admits that something has already begun, and it would be absurd to pretend otherwise. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat. He extended his hand. "Ethan Carter," he said. She looked at it for a moment, then shook it. "Victoria Hayes." He nodded once, as though this were ordinary information rather than the name of one of the most recognizable businesswomen in the country, and she found herself oddly grateful for that, for the absence of the particular expression people usually had when they heard her name for the first time. The slight widening of the eyes. The recalibration. He did not recalibrate. He simply nodded, and looked at her, and waited, in the way that people wait when they are genuinely prepared to hear whatever comes next. "There are moments," Ethan said, after the silence had gone on long enough to become comfortable rather than awkward, "when what we can't afford has nothing to do with money." He said it without drama, without the air of a man producing a rehearsed thought. He said it the way you say something you have learned through actual experience, something you arrived at not from reading but from living through the event that made it true. She went very still. She looked at him, really looked, the kind of looking she had trained herself to do in business negotiations. The kind that reads beneath the surface for the thing the other person is actually offering, and she felt something in her chest shift, very slightly, like a door that has been stuck for a long time moving on its hinges. "Today is my sister's birthday," she said. She had not planned to say it. It came out of her before she had made a decision to speak, which was a thing that almost never happened to her. She was a woman who made decisions before she spoke, always, about every word. She would have been 50 today. Ethan was quiet. He did not say he was sorry immediately, the way people do when they are filling space. He just let the words land where they needed to land. And she was grateful for that, too. "She used to bring me here," Victoria continued, and her voice did something she could not entirely control. "Every year, on her birthday. It was our tradition. She insisted on it. She said a birthday required a real restaurant, and a real meal, and no phones on the table." She stopped. "I always brought my phone." She stopped again. "I was always a little late. Always a little distracted. Always thinking about something at work that was more important than sitting still for 2 hours." She pressed her lips together. "It wasn't more important. I know that now. I knew it then. Actually, I chose it anyway." Ethan did not offer her the ready absolution that people offer when they want the difficult moment to be over. He did not say she had done her best, or that her sister had understood, or that she should forgive herself. He simply held the space, and in holding it, gave her room to stay inside what she was saying, rather than rushing past it toward something easier. It was the rarest thing she had encountered in years, the willingness to simply be present with something painful, without the need to resolve it. "She died 4 years ago," Victoria said. Suddenly. No warning. "I was in a board meeting when they called. I finished the meeting before I left." Her hands had stopped trembling. They were very still now, pressed flat on the linen. "I finished the meeting." There was a silence that felt like its own kind of weight. "I have a great deal of money," she said at last, with a precision that made it sound less like a statement of fact than a confession. "I can buy the building this restaurant is in. I looked it up last year. I could, if I wanted. And I cannot buy one more minute with my sister." Her voice cracked, just slightly, at the very end. "I can't afford that. That is what I meant." Ethan was quiet for a long moment after that. He turned his wineglass slowly between both hands, a gesture Victoria would come to recognize in time as the thing he did when he was choosing his words with particular care, and then he looked up at her and he said, "I lost my wife 8 years ago." He said it plainly, without the studied calm people sometimes affect around loss, without the braced quality of someone preparing to manage their own emotion for the comfort of their listener. He said it the way you state a fact that is both terrible and simply, undeniably true. Her name was Laura. She was 34. Sophie, my daughter, was 5. He paused. For a long time after that, I didn't know how to be in a room with other people. I could manage it functionally. I could have conversations. I could do the grocery shopping and the school drop-off and all of it. But I felt like I was doing it from behind glass, like everyone else was living in a world I could see but not quite reach. He took a breath. I sat alone in a lot of restaurants during those years. Ate a lot of meals while staring at the empty chair across from me. He looked at the chair across from hers, her sister's chair, the one she had been looking at when she said those 4 words. "I know what that chair looks like," he said. From the inside, Victoria did not speak immediately. She was a woman who had built an empire partly on the ability to understand, quickly and precisely, the nature of the thing she was actually dealing with, to strip away presentation and locate the essential truth beneath it. And the essential truth of Ethan Carter, as she was reading it across this candlelit table in the restaurant her sister had loved, was that he was exactly what he appeared to be. No performance, no angle. A man who had been through the particular darkness of profound and irreversible loss and had come out the other side, not unblemished. You could not come through that unblemished but intact, oriented. Still capable of walking across a restaurant to sit beside a stranger who looked like she needed someone to sit beside her. "How did you get through it?" she asked. Not as an investor asking about methodology, as a person asking another person how they had survived. He thought about this carefully. "I stopped trying to carry it alone," he said. "For the first 2 years, I treated the grief like it was something to be managed privately, like it would be an imposition on anyone else to see it. I was very busy being functional. I was also completely hollowed out." He glanced at his glass. "Eventually, I started talking to people. To other parents who'd lost a spouse. To a therapist. For a while. To Sophie, when she was old enough, and sometimes before she was old enough, because she needed to know she could ask about her mother." He paused. "The weight doesn't go away, but it gets shareable. That's the only word I have for it. It gets shareable. And that changes it. Somehow. Not smaller. Exactly. Just possible to carry." Victoria thought about the years she had spent not talking to anyone, not because she had been protecting other people from her grief, but because she had not allowed herself to have it, had categorized the loss of her sister as something to be processed efficiently and then set aside, had given it 3 weeks and a therapist she saw twice, and then had returned to her schedule, as though that were the appropriate response to the end of the only person in the world who had known her before she became the Iron Queen. She had been, she understood now, sitting across from a man who had done the opposite, who had stayed inside the loss long enough to actually be changed by it, profoundly wrong in her approach to the most important thing she had ever had to manage. The irony of that was not lost on her. She was considered one of the great strategic minds in business. She had made the worst possible strategic error in her personal life. And she had made it over and over again for 4 years. and she had not understood it as an error until this evening. At this table, in this conversation with a stranger who fixed cars for a living, she laughed. Not the polished social laugh she used at events, a real one, sudden and unguarded. The kind that surprises the person laughing almost as much as it surprises the person watching. It was the first genuine laugh she had produced in longer than she could precisely remember. And the feeling of it, the sheer physical fact of it, was startling in the best possible way. Ethan looked at her, and his expression was warm and slightly questioning. "Something about the situation?" he said, not unkindly. "Something about me," she said. "I am very good at running things that matter considerably less than this." The restaurant had grown quieter around them as the evening deepened, tables turning over and refilling, the ambient level of conversation shifting with the late hour from the animated to the intimate. Several people had noticed them, the unmistakable Victoria Hayes, sitting across from a man in a good but not expensive jacket, deep in conversation. Her wine mostly untouched, her face entirely different from the controlled public face that appeared in photographs. A woman at a corner table had recognized her early in the evening and had been watching with polite interest ever since, not quite sure what she was witnessing. Something, clearly, something that did not look like business. Ethan asked her about her sister, and Victoria told him. She told him things she had not said aloud since the funeral, that her sister's name was Claire. That Claire had been 3 years younger and considerably wiser in all the ways that mattered. That Claire had been the person who called her when she was about to make a mistake in her personal life, and told her so with a directness that nobody else in her world would attempt. She told him about the birthday dinners here, the particular table, third from the window, which was the table Victoria was sitting at right now, and the realization of this fact had ambushed her when she arrived, and had not left her since. She told him that she had tried, twice since Claire's death, to come to this restaurant, and both times had stood outside on the sidewalk and found that she could not make herself go in. That tonight, the 4th anniversary of Claire's death, and what would have been her 50th birthday, she had simply walked through the door, sat down, ordered what Claire always ordered, the salmon, with the lemon caper sauce, and eaten it alone at their table, and tried to hold on to the sense of being close to something she had lost. "And then the bill came," she said. "And I thought, I'd give everything for Claire to be sitting across from me right now. Every company, every building, every account. And I realized I couldn't do it. I couldn't afford the one thing I actually wanted." She paused. "I must have said it out loud without meaning to." Ethan nodded. "You did. And everyone thought it was a joke. Almost everyone," he said. She looked at him with something that was very close to gratitude, real gratitude, the kind that is not about politeness. And then she looked at the empty chair that had been Claire's, and she felt the particular quality of sadness that has moved, finally, from being something you are fighting to something you are simply feeling. And there was in that shift a kind of relief that she had not anticipated. She had not cried in 4 years, not at the funeral, not in the weeks after, not in the long and silent evenings of the years that followed. She had not allowed it. She was the Iron Queen, and the Iron Queen did not. She cried now, quietly, with the contained precision of someone who has not done this in a very long time and is not entirely sure of the mechanics. But she cried, and she did not stop herself, and the table across from her held a man who looked at her with complete steadiness and did not flinch, and did not look away, and did not reach immediately for a solution. The restaurant went very still. Not silent, there was still music. Still the sound of other conversations, but something had shifted in the collective atmosphere of the room, that subtle change in the quality of attention that happens when a space full of people becomes, without announcing it, oriented around a single moment. The woman in the corner had stopped pretending not to watch. The couple by the window had lowered their voices. A server stood near the kitchen door and did not move. The moment had the quality of something rare, something that reminded everyone in the room, briefly and without words, of the things they knew were true and rarely thought about who they had lost, about the calls they hadn't made, about the chairs at tables that had been empty for years. Victoria composed herself the way she composed herself, precisely, deliberately, with the quiet efficiency of a person who has always managed her own interior weather alone. She pressed her fingers to the corners of her eyes. She took a breath. She straightened her back. And then she looked at Ethan Carter across the table and said, with perfect steadiness, "Why did you do this?" He looked at her for a moment, as if measuring the question. "What do you mean? You paid for my meal. You sat down with me. You've spent the last hour and a half talking to a stranger about things people don't discuss with strangers." She held his gaze. Why? He considered this, and then he said something that she would return to. In the months and years that followed, more times than she could count, would find it in her mind at odd moments, in boardrooms and airports, and in the early mornings, when the city was still quiet and the stone in the center of her chest was heaviest. He said, "I didn't pay for your dinner." She waited. "I bought you a table companion," he said. "Someone to sit across from you. That's all. That's the only thing I paid for." She felt the tears return before she had any warning of them, felt them in her throat first, that specific tightening that comes just ahead of the wave. She did not try to stop them this time. She let them come, and they came. And she sat in a restaurant in front of a stranger, and cried for her sister, and for the 4 years she had spent not crying for her sister, and across the table Ethan Carter sat in the steady way he had sat all evening. And the restaurant around them held that particular silence that a room holds when it has been briefly converted from a place of ordinary living into something it will remember. The applause, when it came, was quiet, just the couple by the window, first, and then a few other tables, not out of performance, but out of the kind of involuntary response that happens when a room has witnessed something that exceeds the ordinary threshold of an evening. Victoria didn't hear it at first. Then, she did. And looked up, and Ethan watched the slight widening of her eyes, the surprise of a woman who was not accustomed to being seen, not in this way, and he smiled. And that smile, she thought, was one of the warmest things she had encountered in a very long time. She tried to thank him properly at the end of the evening. She asked for his business card. She was always, instinctively, a businesswoman. And he gave it to her. A small white card, with the name of the garage, printed simply in black. An address, a phone number. She looked at it. She said, "I would like to compensate you. For the meal, and for this." He shook his head, not unkindly. "The meal was $12 more than mine would have been," he said, "and the rest of it wasn't something to be compensated." She looked at him. "You're refusing money from Victoria Hayes," she said. There was a very faint note of amusement in it, the first faint note of amusement she had produced in this direction all evening. "Most people don't do that." "I'm not most people," he said, simply. "No," she agreed. "You are absolutely not." She thought about him on the drive home. She thought about the garage on a side street on the east side. She thought about a man in a good but not expensive jacket who had sat across from her and absorbed the full weight of an evening like this one, and had not flinched once, and had not wanted anything, and had refused money from one of the wealthiest women in the city, as easily and naturally as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. She told Diane the next morning to find out everything there was to know about Carter's auto service. What Diane found, over the following week, was interesting. The garage was small, 2 bays, 2 full-time mechanics, a third part-time, and it was consistently, over the past several years, in the habit of doing certain things without charging for them. Veterans who came in for routine maintenance were frequently given the work at cost or below. An elderly woman in the neighborhood, who drove a 20-year-old sedan and lived on a fixed income, had been receiving free oil changes for 3 years. When flooding had damaged a community center 2 winters ago, Ethan had spent 4 weekends working on the organization's vehicles at no charge. None of this appeared anywhere in any advertising, because there was no advertising. It was simply something the garage did, quietly, as a matter of course. The way a person breathes, not for credit, not for visibility, but because it was the right thing to do, and Ethan Carter was the kind of man who did the right thing as his default setting. Victoria sat with this information for 2 days. She sat with the memory of him at that table. She sat with the image of a man who had built, in modest and unannounced ways, the kind of life she had been trying for 4 years to figure out how to build a life defined not by what it owned but by what it gave, not by what it accumulated, but by what it chose to stay present for. She thought about the vocational training program she had been considering funding, had been considering for 2 years. In the abstract, as a philanthropic vehicle, without ever quite converting the consideration into action. She thought about skilled trades, and the shortage of qualified mechanics in the city's working-class neighborhoods, and young men and women who needed a path that didn't require a 4-year degree. She thought about a garage on the east side, and a man who could teach not just the technical work, but the philosophy underneath it. The idea that a business existed in relationship to its community, and had obligations to that community that went beyond the strictly transactional. On the 8th day after their dinner, Victoria Hayes walked into Carter's auto service at 9:15 in the morning. Ethan was under a truck when she arrived. One of his mechanics, a young man named Marcus, showed her to a waiting area that contained 3 plastic chairs, a coffee maker that had seen better years, and a small television mounted near the ceiling showing a morning news program on mute. She sat. She waited. She did not check her phone, which for her was roughly equivalent to a fast. Ethan emerged from beneath the truck 12 minutes later, wiped his hands on a gray cloth, and stopped when he saw her. He looked, for just a moment, genuinely surprised, a thing she suspected did not happen to him often. "Miss Hayes," he said. "Ethan," she said. She had decided, sometime in the preceding 8 days, that she was done with formalities where this man was concerned. "I have a proposal for you." He looked at her steadily. "Come in," he said, and led her to a small office in the back that contained a desk, 2 mismatched chairs, a framed photograph of a young girl who was unambiguously his daughter, and a whiteboard covered in numbers that she recognized immediately as the working finances of a business operating on tight, careful margins. She sat in one of the mismatched chairs, and she told him what she had in mind. She told him about the program she wanted to create, a vocational initiative centered on automotive skills, designed for people who needed employment pathways, and had been passed over by systems that prioritize credential over capability. She told him she wanted it grounded in a real working garage, run by someone who understood both the technical side and the human side, who could teach young people not just how to fix an engine but how to show up, how to be reliable, how to understand that a business is a relationship with the people around it. She told him she wanted it to operate in partnership with his garage, with full funding from her foundation, and she told him that she was not interested in having her name on the building or her photograph in the press release or any of the usual arrangements that accompanied this kind of investment. She wanted it to work. She wanted him to run it. She wanted to put real money behind the thing he was already doing in small, quiet ways and make it bigger. He was very still throughout all of this. When she finished, he looked at her for a long moment, and then he looked at the photograph of his daughter, and then he looked back at her. "Why?" he said. She recognized the question. It was the same question she had asked him 8 days ago, at a candlelit table with her sister's ghost at the empty chair. "Because you sat across from me," she said, "and that was worth more than anything I've purchased in a long time. I would like to find out what it looks like when someone like you is given the resources to do everything you've been doing in small ways, at scale." He was quiet for another moment. "I'd need to know you're in it seriously," he said, "that this isn't a gesture." "I don't do gestures," she said. "I have companies. I do investments." He looked at her, and she saw the moment the decision formed behind his eyes, not quick, not impulsive, but considered and certain, the same quality she had seen in him at the restaurant when he had crossed the room toward her, and nothing she had said had changed his mind. "All right," he said, "then let's build something." The program launched 6 months later under the name Second Gear, a name that had been Ethan's idea, and that Victoria had liked immediately for its double meaning. The practical automotive reference, and the sense of a life finding traction after a stall. It was housed in a new facility 2 blocks from the original garage, larger and better equipped, with 3 full bays, a classroom, and a staff that included Ethan, 2 additional master mechanics he recruited, and a program coordinator named Diana, who had herself gone through a workforce development program 15 years earlier, and now ran one of the most effective re-entry employment networks in the city. The first cohort was 12 people. The second was 22. By the end of the first full year, 73 graduates had completed the program, and employment placement was running at 86%, a number that Victoria's foundation tracked carefully, and that she found on the spreadsheets Diane prepared for her monthly. more satisfying than any quarterly return she had reviewed in recent memory. The press found out about second gear at the 6-month mark, through a story a local reporter had pieced together from public records. The story mentioned Victoria's foundation and described the initiative in reasonable detail. It mentioned Ethan Carter and the garage. It did not know, and Victoria had no intention of telling it, what the origin of the whole thing had been: the bill on a linen tablecloth, the trembling hands, the 4 words spoken to no one in particular that had nevertheless been heard by exactly the right person. Some things did not need to be explained. Some things explained themselves in what they produced. What they produced, in the year following the launch of Second Gear, extended further than the program itself. Ethan and Victoria had continued their dinners at Hargrove not every week, but often, and always at the table by the window rather than the one by the wall, because Victoria had explained to him, 3 dinners in, that she found she needed a different view now than she had on the night they met. The table by the window was brighter. She could see more of the room. She preferred it. Over those dinners, they talked about the program, and about Sophie, who was 14 now, and apparently in a phase of finding everything her father did mortifying in the specific way that 14-year-olds find things mortifying, which Ethan reported with the rueful affection of a man who understood that this was its own form of love. They talked about Claire. Not every time, and not always at length, but enough that the silence where Claire had been was no longer a sealed room but an open one. A room with windows, a room that Victoria could enter and leave as needed, without feeling that the entry itself was a betrayal. She had, with Ethan's encouragement, finally gone to see a therapist who specialized in grief, had made the appointment twice before actually keeping it, had arrived at the first session already prepared to explain that she was fine, had found, 20 minutes into the conversation, that she was not fine at all, and had not been fine for 4 years, and had left the session feeling simultaneously terrible, and relieved in the way you feel terrible, and relieved when a thing you have been carrying incorrectly is finally, carefully set down. She went back the following week, and the week after that. She told no one except Ethan. He said, "Good." He said, "It helps." She was a different kind of businesswoman in the months that followed, not softer, not less driven, not less capable of the precision and force that had built everything she had, but different in a quality that was harder to name, something to do with the presence she brought into rooms, something to do with the way she listened. Several people on her senior team noticed it and mentioned it to each other in the cautious way that people mention things they have observed about their employer without quite understanding them. One of them, her CFO, a man who had worked with her for 11 years, said simply that she seemed like someone who was sleeping better. He meant it as a compliment. He was right, in ways he didn't fully understand. 1 year and 3 weeks after the evening at Hargrove, Victoria Hayes arrived at the restaurant for dinner with Ethan Carter. She was on time. She did not check her phone in the car on the way. She was wearing, for the first time in years, something that had not been selected primarily for the image it projected: a dark blue dress that she had bought because she liked it, full stop, without any further calculation. The maitre d' led her to the table by the window, which he had learned was her preference. Ethan was already there, which was also his preference, and hers. She liked arriving to find him already seated, liked the sight of him looking up when she walked in, the particular quality of his expression that meant he was glad she was there. They ordered what they always ordered now: the lamb for him, the salmon for her, because it had been Claire's choice, and because eating it felt, still, like a small and private act of love towards someone who was gone. The waiter brought the bill at the end of the evening, and Victoria reached for it. She had reached for it every time, for a year now, because it seemed like the right correction to make a small reversal of the original transaction, though both of them knew the original transaction had never actually been about money. Ethan watched her look at the bill. He watched her expression, the ease of it, the absence of the particular weight that had been in that expression a year ago, the way she sat in the chair with a quality of presence she had not had then, a quality of being fully, genuinely, unreservedly here. He leaned back slightly in his chair, with the small, quiet smile of a man who is content. "Can you afford it this time?" he said. She looked at him across the table, across Claire's chair, which was no longer empty in the same way it had been, which contained, now, the ghost of a woman who would have loved everything about this evening, and she laughed. She laughed the real laugh, the one she had produced for the first time a year ago, and had been producing more regularly ever since, the one that started somewhere lower than the polished social version, and came out warmer and less controlled and entirely her own. And then, because it was true, because it was more true than anything she had said in this room, or any other room in a very long time, she said, "Thanks to you, I finally can." She meant the bill. She also meant the year, and the program, and the dinners, and the therapist, and the photograph of Sophie. She now kept in her office next to a photograph of Claire, and the mornings when she woke up and the stone was lighter, and the evenings when she sat at the window of her apartment and looked out at the city and felt, for the first time in years, that she was actually part of it rather than merely above it. She meant all of it, and Ethan Carter, who was a man who understood what people meant when they said more than the words they were saying, understood all of it too, and nodded, and raised his glass, and said nothing more, because there was nothing more that needed to be said. There is a particular kind of wealth that cannot be measured by any instrument that finance has yet invented, cannot be tracked on a spreadsheet, cannot be converted into a quarterly figure, cannot be held in any account or recorded in any ledger. It is the wealth of being known by someone who sees you clearly, and stays anyway. It is the wealth of a table, where the empty chair no longer looks like an ending. It is the wealth of having learned, late, but not too late, that the most important thing in a room is never the bill, it is who is sitting across from you when the bill arrives. Victoria Hayes had spent 20 years building an empire, and it was real, and it had value, and she would never pretend otherwise. She had made things that would outlast her programs, buildings, funds, a legacy in brick and steel and balance sheet that would carry her name long after she was gone. She did not regret the work. The work had been her truest self for a long time, and dismissing it would have been a dishonesty she was not willing to perform. But she understood now, with the clarity that only comes when you have been on the other side of something and can look back at the crossing point, that the work had been a partial life, a life of enormous accomplishment and genuine contribution, lived inside a shell that kept the most important things from getting in. She had built the shell herself, stone by stone, year by year. One meeting chosen over one phone call, one quarterly report chosen over one birthday dinner, until the shell had become so solid and so well constructed that she had almost forgotten there was anything inside it that needed air. But the night a stranger in a good but not expensive jacket crossed a restaurant and sat down beside her because her hands were trembling, and no one else had noticed, that was the night she became rich in a way that none of her companies, and none of her buildings, and none of her carefully accumulated years of relentless forward motion had ever managed to make her. And she knew it. And it was enough. And sometimes, on the very best evenings, sitting across from Ethan Carter at the table by the window at Hargrove, with the salmon and the lemon caper sauce and the warmth of a room full of people living their ordinary, irreplaceable lives around her, it was more than enough. It was everything. Because sometimes the most valuable thing in the world is not something you build, or buy, or win. Sometimes it is simply someone who is willing to sit down and stay.